Welcome to Data Beats. Today, David, the co founder of Avora, is here to answer some questions about building and using data infrastructure. So, here we go. Hey, David, thanks for joining.
Thanks for having me up.
Of course. So, let's jump right in, David. Please tell us what it means to build data infrastructure in the context of the modern data landscape.
I think there's a typical kind of stack that's understood as infrastructure in terms of being able to ELT, a data warehouse, a BI tool on top, and then now increasingly there's additional non-core pieces like reverse ETL, observability, CDPs, streaming tools as well that are being added to this infrastructure.
Right. Cool. So, what are the core components of a well executed data infrastructure?
So I think the difference between well executed, I think it's about things that ensure quality, things that ensure reliability. So especially around the development process. So being able to use version control, CI/CD in your development process, that's going to really enable what well executed, what I think most people consider well executed looks like, and that's where frameworks like DBT come in, which have been enabling development on top of data pipelines flowing from the into the data warehouse and on the data warehouse. That's enabled. We're looking for like more tools like that to spread further out, and DBT to take a bigger footprint as well to push that quality outwards.
Right. So if we talk about building a basic data infrastructure, right, like a
Yeah,
minimum viable data stack, if you may, what would be the like two or three tools that would comprise a minimum viable data stack?
sure. So it depends on your context. So for some companies, if you have to work with a lot of third party tools, you definitely need like an ELT tool, like Fivetran, Airbyte, Gravity Data. You need one of those kinds of tools to help you get data from those third party systems into your data warehouse. Obviously, then you need a data warehouse. I personally think like for a minimum viable data stack, you want a data warehouse that's quite easy to use and that's kind of scales without much needed thought and planning. You don't want to need to have a DBA. So I think Snowflake and BigQuery are the two easiest to use. BigQuery is possibly even easier for a smaller startup. It's basically use it and forget about it. Nothing to do.
Right. Cool. Yeah, that makes sense. So, David, can you tell us why there's been an explosion in terms of data infrastructure tooling over the last couple of years?
I think it's because Um, what we it's a bit of a hangover from the big data era. So in the big data era, in order to do any amount of data engineering, you'd have to hire a huge amount of very expensive people. So I've been at a company where we were on SQL Server when I joined the company as our analytics like stack, and they planned to do a big migration to Hadoop on Hortonworks, and it took years, and they hired a data engineering team of 50 people, paying them, a huge amount of money, and it actually failed. They didn't even succeed in this data project. So what we've realized, and venture capitalists have realized, is that that data engineering space is ripe for automation and for SaaS tooling. And so that's more or less achieved now. If you think of like Fivetran, especially from a batch point of view, you've got big companies out there now like Fivetran, Airbyte, who've kind of enabled most of the connectors you'd need in the space. Um, and and you've got like some VCs who even identify as like Hadoop refugees. They know about the pain from that era, and that's why they've invested in removing some of that pain.
Right. Thanks, David. That makes sense. So, okay, so building infrastructure is one thing and probably a fun thing for those building it. But how do organizations get various teams to actually use the infrastructure and benefit from it?
So I think this is about communication and access. So I think like in the past, you've seen uh, because of inelasticity of how compute scaled on those systems, the access to those systems has been closely guarded. Purely data teams would have access to like data warehouses and BI tools and things like that. And with the proliferation of of cloud and cloud data warehouses, that then got pushed outwards. And at the last company I worked at, List, everyone had access to look at, and Looker was sitting on Snowflake. It never had any like capacity issues. So that's kind of like how this data infra becomes accessible to everyone, not just those building it, but the whole organization. So I think that that separation of compute from storage is like a really key piece of how that became possible.
Right. And do you have any specific thoughts on how data adjacent teams like product teams and growth teams can actually derive value from a good data infrastructure?
Yeah, and I think this is really interesting because actually those teams are often what I call like data domain owners. So if you've got a product team that's building a feature, let's say it's some kind of feed of products on an e-commerce site, for example. They're generating potentially many data points from their product feature, and then every time they iterate on it, it generates more of a different kind. So actually planning how that tracking is done and planning to make it done well to avoid future analytics engineering work or the work that's not even possible, that I think it's almost like they are self-enabled. If they make good decisions when they're planning their engineering work, testing it well, making sure the tracking is good, that enables them to actually get value from the data.
Right. Cool. Yeah. And how do you suggest data teams find a balance between building infrastructure and supporting the day-to-day needs of the organization?
So, yeah, this is something I've had to manage where, and sometimes you can do it structurally. So I ran a hub and spoke model. So I had a central team of analytics engineers and a handful of analysts, and then we had distributed analysts and analytics engineers as well. And the central team would often do that building infrastructure, building new ways of doing things or core pieces of the stack that other teams could then build on top of. And then the day-to-day needs were often met by the team members on the spokes who sat with those commercial parts of the organization that needed support. Now that helps, but I think you also, apart from structurally, you also need to think about how do we do this from like a philosophy, like a philosophy way. Like we believe in dealing with tech debt. We believe in spending time on infrastructure to make it good and to be a force multiplier for future execution. Right. That has got to be in there as well.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, thanks, David. That makes sense. So there are folks who believe that the modern data stack is a fad, and that organizations should refrain from stitching together half a dozen tools. So, what are your thoughts here?
The thing is, I come from a background of having done that stitching and got value from it, and I've managed to deliver with a handful of people and that stitched together stack more than I've seen that big data era or previous era teams able to achieve. And so the modern data stack is not a fad. Could it be better interoperable? Yes, absolutely. Could there be some bundling? Sure, half a dozen tools sounds like a lot. I don't think it's that much, but you're seeing now fragmentation of up to like a dozen tools. And I think, yes, you're getting to a point where who wants to manage that many vendors? And I've seen new startups actually whose pure whose pure focus is stitching the tools together so that any customer has like one Okta like entry point and has access and choice to many of these tools that get automatically stitched together. So you can see that there is need, but I do believe that the modern data stack is valuable.
Right. Cool. Me too. So, what are the biggest pros of infrastructure comprising best of breed purpose built tools over an all-in-one does-it-all solution?
Yeah, so I think like if you think about the most typical like all-in-one solution, you'd probably think of like Microsoft Power BI and like uh, Synapse SQL Server type setup. Now, the interoperability on that system is very good, right? That's one thing that users like about it. The vendor management's very easy. You get all of your tools bundled together at one price. All of your organization has access to it as part of their typical licensing, right? So in terms of cost and like managing the tools, it's easier. There's the pros of that like all-in-one stack. Cons are, you know, fundamentally they're not focused on any specific area of that tooling, right? They've and you've seen this, like how Snowflake's beaten Redshift. They've just invested the time and the thought to just focus on this one thing and do it extremely well, and they're reaping the rewards of that. And you've seen, Fivetran do the same in ELT. Like Microsoft's ELT is not as easy to use and not as comprehensive. And so what you end up doing is when you have that all-in-one solution, yes, it's cheaper and it's stuck together nicely, but no single piece of it does anything to the very best of it in its class. Whereas when you have the best in breed solutions, you get things that are really good. So how do you kind of get the best in breed to work together? That's interoperability, and I think with frameworks like DBT in existence, that's allowing for those tools to interoperate better than before. And I think you'll see in the next couple of years interoperability as good as a bundled, like an all-in-one stack.
Yeah, that'll be really cool if that happens. Cool. Thanks, David. Last question for you. What is the one piece of advice you have for companies that are just getting started on the data journey?
Um, I think, especially if they're a B2C company, get your tracking right. Just start with your tracking. Put in a CDP. There's many like cheap or open source ones like Rudderstack, Snowplow out there. Put that in right away. Put something into Governit like Avo, and then get that piping to a data warehouse. Don't worry about what you have to do after that, but that's fine. Don't worry about making some complex data lake pipe to data warehouse stack. Just get it from your app to your to your to your data warehouse reliably, consistently, completely. That's just a fantastic starting point. And then even if you don't have the people to analyze that or the time to analyze it or get value from it, when you do finally get around to it, you've got this wealth of pretty good data to use later. Um, so I think that's one advice I'd give to a company starting on their data journey. And also, if you are struggling, you know, and maybe it's worth getting consultants in to help you. If you don't feel like you've got the time or the focus to build a data team or to set things up properly, but you need to just pay. I think it's spend the equivalent money on consultants who'll just get it done for you, and you'll get you'd probably be surprised at how much you get for your money because of how much building an internal team and how long it takes to scale costs.
100%. I'm totally with you on that, David. Thank you so much. Thanks for answering my questions and sharing your insights. You have a great day, David.
Thanks, Arpit.
Evaluating data solutions, explore the modern data landscape on asterisk.com.